avant-garde impetus, notably the work of Polish composers. So we have here the events. First at the UNIAC, we have a performance of Brauer's Sonograma Uno for prepared piano. This was the first Cuban work to make use of indeterminacy, meaning that there are certain parameters that are established by the composer, but the performer, him or herself, really makes decisions about what the piece is going to sound like and what they're going to do. So every iteration, every time a piece is performed, it's going to be different. Every recording is going to be different. That was a big deal, that this was the first Cuban work to use, in Spanish they use aleatorismo, but we usually try to say indeterminism, or indeterminate. And then the first concert, so let me say that this is the 50th anniversary of all of this, by the way, since it's 2014. And the National Electroacoustic Lab this year celebrated this particular event in February as marking the 50th anniversary of the first time that new music by Cuban composers using electronic means was performed in Cuba. This was a very big deal, and it was by Juan Blanco, and it was presented at the UNIAC. And it was, I mean, as you can see, he'd been working on electronic music since before, but this was the first performance, the first situation where people outside of their very small circle could come across it. And then in July, the La Sinfónica Nacional de Cuba presented a concert in which they framed Blanco's piece for magnetic tape and orchestra, Texturas, by work by Polish composers, Tadeusz Bird, Grażyna Wacewicz, and Krzysztof Penderecki. And this is the point, the sort of middle point in Brauer's article, of where he's saying where and how avant-garde music is progressing during that first decade. Throughout the whole article, Brauer argues that the Cuban composer is free, and is both free and committed. Free to create, but also committed to bring their music to the people. And that they are able to do this because, according to Brauer, the revolution has developed a socially conscious citizen that is not prejudiced as a listener. By the same token, the avant-garde Cuban composer is able to bring avant-garde to the music, avant-garde music to the people, because the revolution creates spaces and opportunities for them to do so, in particular for mass and public events. And did I? No, I didn't do that. Okay. So I have a list here of a few of the events that Brauer and Blanco wrote music for that were actually mass events, that were not just music focused, but for example, the local Cuban Olympics, Blanco provided electronic music for that. The celebration of the 13th anniversary of the Movimiento 26 de Julio in 1966, Brauer provided music for that. And then Blanco and others provided music for the Cuban pavilions at the International Expos in '67 in Montreal, and then in 1970 in Osaka. So these are just some of the ways, and I already mentioned the Ambientación de la Rampa also, so these are all the ways in which they are reaching the masses. Brauer argues that, quote, "It is obvious that the demand for our work is the result of the functionality of this music in the current world, where mass communication media acquire an important dimension and avant-garde music becomes more functional, in this sense, than standardized products." And that's the end of that quote. So now I'm going to talk about the first piece, where we have the LP here at the Díaz Ayala collection, La Tradición se rompe, pero cuesta trabajo. In 1969, the work is from 1969. It was premiered by the Cuban National Symphony Orchestra, and the LP cover, the LP is from 1970, includes a series of notes about the work. And these notes were written by Ángel Vázquez Millares, but Brauer includes these same notes in his description of this work in the article La Avant-garde en la música cubana. So this becomes like the narrative of the description of this piece. There are a few, and I have some things here that we can go over, but this is transcribed and translated from the LP cover. So the first thing is that signs are shown to the audience throughout the whole performance, because the audience must participate. And so the audience is supposed to close their eyes at one point to be surprised. They're supposed to go shh with the conductor. They're supposed to clap at certain points. So it's all of this audience interaction is supposed to make this a pop event or a happening. So this is one of the ways in which this is experimental, but also quotation, because at the very beginning he says, a violinist stands up and attacks the presto from the Sonata in G by Bach. Almost simultaneously, a second player plays Beethoven, and so on in succession, forming a heterophony with the great classics that transforms them into a new result. The author's sonority starts to be introduced, which manages to displace the previous one, and then goes on to keep describing this. The idea of cliché, of the traditional repertory. So what we have is that he is quoting music by other composers from previous, centuries, really, not just generations, but centuries. It results in a collage because we have the superimposition of both his own music and the music of these other composers. We have controlled indeterminacy because he sort of tells the performers what to do, but they can kind of do it however they want. So that way he's investing musicians with a sense of independence and agency in the creation of the work of art. So the work of art is not just created by Brouwer, but it's created at the moment when everything comes together with the audience, the conductor, and the musicians. The composer's sonority overtakes that of the master's, and he is challenging the concept of time by experiencing several historic epochs simultaneously. So the audience is listening music that he or she would not listen exactly at the same time, but they're listening to it at the same time. The polystylistic results obliterates the hierarchies of classical music that had been established and preserved by the cultural elite in the decades prior to the revolution, and this is the hierarchies that had been preserved and guarded by the patronage and by certain conductors that Grammages so poignantly criticizes in his, piece about the 30th anniversary of the Philharmonic, yes. It was the Philharmonic before '59. The work's rebellious tones, both in the liner notes and in the music, situated at the vanguardia of Cuban classical music. It does not only oppose the traditional classical repertory, but secures Brouwer's place within the revolution as an artista comprometido who enacts the revolution's rebellious spirit through his work. So when we look at the score, it has an appendix. This is the appendix. This is at the end. And it has, these boxes are basically the excerpts of previously composed music from other works that are actually very identifiable to a listener that tends to go a lot to these kinds of concerts. So this is the appendix from which the musicians can take their excerpts and can play. Then it also provides performance indications right here. You can't see them very well, but it's a lot of dots and lines and squiggly things. But he is basically doing like a little leyenda, like this is what this symbol means, so when I use it, you do this. So the musician really has to learn what the symbols mean before actually starting to play the piece, because it's not traditional notation. He comes up with his own way of notating, which is something he borrows from the Polish school, because that's what the Polish composers started doing at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 60s. So he's in direct dialogue with the Polish school. He also gives a note here on how to prepare the signs. And this is so funny because he says, los carteles deben de ser realizados en el estilo tipográfico más actualizado de la época en que se toque la pieza. So he is very conscious about the typography of the signs that are going to be shown to the audience. So he's already inserting himself in the canon because he's thinking, this piece is going to be performed later. So for later generations, let's make it relevant for them. So that's Brouwer. He also gives the performers individual agency, because not only does he say, oh, you're performing these parts, but you have to play them de pie, de pie, de pie. So as you're watching, if you're in the audience, you usually just see the orchestra, they all play their thing, and unless it's a concerto where the soloist is at the very front doing their thing, the rest are like an army, of soldiers, just, bowing away or playing away. And what he's asking is that when they play a famous excerpt, they stand up. They have to, so visually, it also engages the audience, which is, we have sound recordings of this, but we don't have video recordings, which would have been fun to have access to. Okay, so let's listen to what this sounds like, and I'm going to show you a sound clip. These speakers, I have turned them all the way up. I have turned all the volume all the way up, so and there's a little bit of noise and stuff coming around. But this is about 3/4 of the way into the piece. Here it says just piano etude, apéndice, so you've got to go to the appendix and figure out what you're going to play. And now, this. So I decided to cut it out there. But the excerpt begins, I already said that. So Brouwer's sonority interrupts and attacks the 3 excerpts of classical music, and I'm going to show them to you here. This first bit is from an allegro from a symphony by George Frederick Handel, and I give you there the estimated dates so you have an idea. Then the horn line, and this is a very famous horn line. All the horn players have to nail this for every single audition. So this is Strauss to Eulenspiegel. And then the other excerpt that gets interrupted here is Franz Liszt piano transcription of a Paganini etude. So we have these different time periods and these different sonorities coming in. The dissonant full chords, orchestral chords, along with the percussion section, playing in tandem with, but independently from the rest of the orchestra, starkly contrast with the 3 solo excerpts. Well, it's 2 solo excerpts, and the previous one is orchestral. That they attack. The orchestra drowns out the sound of the classics, imposing Brouwer's sonority. The musical and compositional traits and techniques do not mark this work as experimental on their own. It's the composer's intention and the way he expects the audience to engage with the work that makes it experimental music, but also the ideological goals of the Cuban Revolution's cultural policies being folded into it. He challenges audiences' expectations, as the title says, La tradición se rompe, he's breaking with tradition. And also the liner note saying that the musicians are attacking the great masters. All of this language points to this challenge, this rebellious spirit. He creates a new work by superimposing works from a variety of styles and time periods, and he challenges the listener's concept of times. The classics are explicitly used as weapons against the very tradition they represent. So this break from tradition, as well as its active engagement with audience members, enacted the Cuban Revolution's rebellious spirit and cements Brouwer as a composer ideologically committed to the revolutionary goals. And he has been very well funded throughout his career, even today and to this day. And he is given a lot of permission to travel. So he has had a lot of, he is well taken care of by the government, let's just put it that way. So I'm looking at the time, and it's getting a little late. So I'm thinking that maybe I'll skip this section on film. No? Okay, so I can show you very quickly the film excerpt. Stuff about the ideological reasoning for film. It helps spread the revolutionary message. So we're looking at Lucia from 1968, directed by Humberto Solás. It is divided in 3 parts, and he uses, in an article, he wrote an article for Cine Cubano where he explains how he approached composing this work. So he wrote the music for it sort of backwards. He started writing the 1960 portion and then moved to the 1932 portion and then 1895. And the only moments where he uses new or avant-garde experimental techniques are in the 1895 section. And he uses them, and he himself, and I had listened to it and watched this film and made this conclusion, gotten to this conclusion before I saw this article, and then I saw this article and I said, this is perfect. It couldn't have come from a better, at a better time. But he says he uses this particular of music for surreal moments in the film. So I'm going to show you one surreal moment. This is not surreal yet, but the juxtaposition is.
Con este silencio se van a dar cuenta que aquí pasa algo raro. Deberíamos reírnos.
¡Uy! Si al menos todo esto sirviera para que ganásemos la guerra.
Cállense, niñas, y trabajen más.
La guerra la ganamos si hablamos menos y trabajamos más. Además, si alguien gana la guerra son los mambistas. Así que goce y deja de quejarte. Que en esa hamaca va a descansar alguien que buena falta le hace.
¡Maldito seas, pueblo del diablo! ¡Que tu río se seque! ¡Que todos revienten de sed! ¡Que tus mujeres paran bestias! ¡Vive España! ¡Ojalá reviente! ¡No valen para nada! ¡Vive España! ¡Vive! ¿Y tú? ¡Viva España! ¡Vamos! ¡Que salga uno! Yo lo que quiero es uno que me diga algo. ¡Uno! ¡Que salga uno aquí para ver lo que pasa! ¡Bandidos descarados! ¡Hijos de mala madre! ¡Ya veréis de lo que somos capaces!
So this scene is happening outside of the house of where these young women are embroidering and sewing and doing all of these things. So it's this juxtaposition of the internal, private, secluded, protected lives with the outside reality of the Revolutionary War. So in the article for Cine Cubano, Brauer emphasizes the historical distance and universal themes of Lucia 1895 that allowed viewers to relate to the issues presented in this portion of the film. And he quotes loneliness, love, sentimental betrayal for whatever reason, and death. By engaging with the universal musical language of the 1960s avant-garde music, Brauer highlights the universality of the surreal moments of this portion of the film, and which I have just pointed out. Brauer's use of avant-garde and experimental music fulfills both aesthetic and political goals. It heightens the visually surreal scenes with unexpected and unusual music, and critiques the colonial situation and the struggle between criollos and peninsulares that resulted in the war-ravaged country. So I'm going to read a conclusion, and this should take less than a minute. So the writings of Gramach, Blanco, and Brauer present a set of recurring common concerns among Cuban composers. Before 1959, Cuban composers struggled to reach audiences due to the established cultural elite's preference and support of traditional and conventional music, ignoring contemporary music by Cuban and Latin American composers. After 1959, avant-garde music embodied the rebellious spirit of the revolution and supported its ideology. Composers gained access to the masses through government-sponsored mass communication, and according to the composers, post-1959 audiences were more open and less prejudiced against new music because it becomes part of their everyday lives, thanks to the revolution. In spite of their rupture in political and socioeconomic systems brought by the Cuban Revolution, Cuban composers continued to promote new music as their predecessors and themselves had done in decades prior. Cuban composers' engagement with avant-garde and experimental compositional approaches fulfilled the revolution's goals of shaping a socially conscious citizen, presented these composers as artistas comprometidos, who engaged with musical means of production prevalent in new music circles throughout the world, fulfilled the revolution's internationalist aims as well as Cuban composers' aesthetic needs for experimentation, all while bringing avant-garde and experimental music to a large section of the Cuban citizenry. Okay, thank you. So do we have time?
I think we do.
I mean,
Everyone's
I
still
guess
here.
everyone who wants to stay. Yes.
It strikes me in hearing and looking at your quotes from Brouwer that it's an interesting question who he is writing these things for. And I would suggest that perhaps he is writing these things for his colleagues within the Soviet Union, because the artistic situation of new music in the Soviet Union in the 1950s was very repressive, at least until the death of Stalin. And it's only at the very beginning of the Russian Revolution, before the death of Lenin and Trotsky, that you actually have an artistic scene in the Soviet Union that is avant-garde. After that, the avant-garde is very heavily repressed, and particularly in the 1950s, in which Shostakovich has no possibility of writing any public music that is anything other than Soviet realism. So the music in the Soviet Union is vastly more conservative. So when I see this quote saying, we can use these techniques which will enrich the music, universal music of the people, without the danger of deformation, I don't think he's writing for anybody in the new music scene in the first world. I think he is writing this specifically saying to the communists in the Soviet Union, see, we have a revolution in which we can have avant-garde music, and the true revolution is one in which the artistic expression of the people is safeguarded and is not repressed as you are doing in the Soviet Union. Which is kind of a difficult space to negotiate.
And I agree completely. I agree that his writings have multiple audiences, I think, in mind. I think that not necessarily, I don't think it's an internal audience, especially were Cine Cubano, Casa de las Americas, these journals are going outside of Cuba. So, and they're being read not only throughout Latin America, but in the United States too. And I think what he's trying to say is that you can be avant-garde and experimental outside of capitalism too. I think that's what he's trying to say, and actually, I really think he's critiquing the U.S. side, saying, you think you have freedom, you think because you are in a capitalist system, but we actually are the ones who have the freedom, because the revolution actually gives access to all of this music to everyone, and we are not in our ivory towers, and we are not we're not writing for only this special, specific audience of the intellectual and musical elite. So I think he's doing that too. I think it has multiple meanings and audiences. I think you are right. It is for the Soviet Union, but also for the U.S.
But I think the specific word deformation,
I
think that is very highly targeted towards the
I
question
agree.
of ideological correctness, which I think is not something that would be worried about by Copeland or Lucas Foss or anybody in the avant-garde in the United States in 1960. Specifically the ideological question that has to do with the communist line and the arts.
But these composers were still, in the U.S., were still accused of being leftist and the, McCarthy era. So they had themselves to deal with certain parameters of ideology.
But this is already after that.
Yes.
Well after that.
Yeah. But I'm just saying that it goes back and forth, I think. But yes, deformation, I think absolutely. It's saying something about the Soviet Union, the approach of composition there. Yeah.
Just want to make a quick comment. I'm glad that you bring this quote from the book. That is the compilation was the essay, La música, lo cubano, la innovación. Because it's in 2003, if I don't remember wrong, he had like revision of the same book, like because the first time he published it, those compilations, he was like completely obsessed with the revolution, and everything was like extreme. He was like a standing icon of the he embraced that revolutionary attitude and position. But when he revised the book again in 2003, he is in the beginning of the book, the introduction is an aclaratory note saying that actually wasn't even written by him, but his wife, actual wife, saying that sometimes
Isabel.
we get so, Isabel Hernandez, we get so excited about certain moment because it's historical condition and historical context. So, especially in the 1960s, he was the privileged person that comes before the embargo was established, and she mentioned that. He was only 21 on the other hand, to Harold and Blanco, they were like older person, they were part of the older movement. Leo wasn't part of those movements, he was too young for that. And he had the chance to come to the US in the 1960 to study, I think it's Juilliard, if I don't...
Manhattan.
In Manhattan,
Manhattan. No, Angulo was Manhattan.
And Leo
was Juilliard, yeah.
Yes, so...
and Hart School of Music in Connecticut.
Yeah, you're right. And when he came back to Cuba, immediately he was assigned with a Grupo de Experimentación Sonora.
Well, no.
After that, but anyway, part of the ICAIC.
It was the ICAIC, and he started Grupo de Experimentación Sonora wasn't until 67, 68.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is like he was like he embraced it that way because he was a privileged person, and he was like, this is my project, and giving everything and receiving everything. And it was like one of the lines of the revolution at that particular moment in the early 60s was the masificación de la cultura.
Claro.
And was only that, was also the National School of Arts system that was implemented after. So many things were happening or contributing for him to express or have that attitude as a composer, and that concept of that. The revolution is on, and we have to be against the other part. So the other, whatever was on the other side was bad. Politically speaking, but in the culturally speaking, he was embracing everything that was new at the same time, and his music stands for that. His music says that about it. He changed completely the direction of the Escuela Cubana de Guitarra.
Yeah.
Completely, and he experimented in any possible way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Brouwer and the other composers and the wider debate about culture, art, literature, and Fidel's famous words, within the revolution and everything, that kind of thing?
Yes. There's a little bit that I did not read, but Brouwer used those words that dentro de la revolución todo fue contra la revolución nada. He even used those in one of his articles for Cine Cubano, explaining that that all of the arts come together in film, and that and one of the things he was critiquing in other film music is that sometimes you would find film music that would be extracted and removed from the actual film experience, and he said that's not good film music. Good film music exists only with everything else that happens in the film. And that's when he says, dentro de la revolución todo contra la revolución nada, and he says, everything has to go towards this one goal. So he was very involved with Humberto Solás and Jose Masip, and especially the ICAIC was a special place. The ICAIC was a special place where they had the access to the technology. Nowhere else would they have had access to the recording and electronic technology. So the ICAIC became this space for, that's one of the things that I argue in one chapter in the dissertation, is that it becomes like a workshop, a taller, because all of the young composers are going there and writing, and it becomes a way for them to have a living, to make a living, but the music gets recorded. You wouldn't have had that happen in other kinds of situations, and it gets mass disseminated. So there's several reasons, in several ways in which then you don't have only the ICAIC, but you have all the dance companies, the theater. Héctor Angulo was very much involved with the Teatro Guignol. They are involved with the rest of the arts very, very much from the beginning, because in part, I think that the Sociedad Cultural Nostromo really set the basis for what was going to happen in the 60s. So their work, you know, all of the main players in Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo went on to have like big positions in the revolution, in, you know, directing or being the president or running or advising certain cultural institutions. So they were already used to this, it's not just about music, it's about all of the arts. It's just that music, especially instrumental music, could get away with a lot more because it doesn't have a text tied to it necessarily. So a lot of times when they are doing settings of text, of poetry, it's José Martí, it's Nicolás Guillén, it's Federico García Lorca. It's the things that are admissible when they use text. But the instrumental music, they could go as far as they wanted. Yeah. I'm sorry, did that, okay. Yeah.
I'm wondering because, you know, you're explaining that all these artists would gather together and they would experiment with. What about copyrights? I mean, was that part of the government of Cuba, the regime? Do they have the copyrights, or are the artists themselves having the copyrights?
You know what? I have not dug deep enough into copyright law in Cuba to establish that. My inkling would be the artist has the copyright, holds copyright to the work, the composer. But whatever you're gaining copyright-wise from publishing music, like any other type of work that you get paid for, the government keeps a certain I mean, you get taxed. So I would assume something like that's happening, but that's a very interesting question about copyright that I have not looked into. But as far as I know, they do keep ownership. There is a sense of ownership over their work.
So then they receive royalties?
I actually do not know that part of it, because especially if you have people recording outside of Cuba and you're paying royalties through companies like Harry Fox and Limelight, how do those companies make sure that they are receiving royalties? However, in popular music, I know that there have been a lot of songs, popular boleros,